Hello everyone, we're live again tonight, and tonight we've got an All Wales episode of MHTV. So I'm going to introduce you to my guests in a minute, but first of all over to my colleague Nicky to tell you a bit about social media tonight.
Good evening, everybody. As ever, your participation is what makes this really come alive. So if you've got any questions for our panels, anything you want us to clarify, please let us know. You can do that on Twitter using the hashtag MHTV, or you can join us on Facebook Live, and that's the MHNA page, and just comment away. And I'll be looking down because I'll be retweeting, commenting, and so please join in. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Nicky. So tonight we're talking about mental health nursing, policy, voice and power. So quite a lot to cover in 45 minutes, but hopefully a nice lively discussion. So what I'm going to do first of all is just go around the panel first of all, just to introduce themselves, and then we'll probably start with a bit of a discussion about Wales and what's unique about Wales in terms of mental health nursing. So on my screen I've got Michelle, are you happy to start? And then yes. I've got Hazel and then Ben, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Michelle Forkings, and I'm the Associate Director of Nursing, Divisional Nurse for Mental Health and Learning Disabilities in Aneurin Bevan University Health Board. Lovely to join you this evening. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And Hazel?
Oh, thank you. Again, delighted to be with you this evening. I'm Hazel Powell. I'm Nursing Officer for Mental Health and Learning Disability at Welsh Government.
Lovely. Thanks for joining us. And Ben, I think a lot of people will recognise you, but do you want to introduce yourself tonight as part of this edition?
Yeah, I'm wearing a different hat tonight. Yes, thanks, Vanessa. So my name is Ben Hannigan. I'm a mental health nursing academic in the School of Healthcare Sciences at Cardiff University. And in this context, I'm probably a bit unusual, actually, that I think I've studied policy, and I think it's really interesting. So if there's one thing I want people to kind of maybe take away from this, is the idea that policy is super relevant and it's everybody's business. But yeah, we'll come to that later, I'm sure.
Great. Yeah, definitely. Well, I've been looking forward to tonight because I think it must be about 3 years ago that I came over to Cardiff when you've been doing your All Wales mental health nursing work, and met some of you then. So what really struck me, I'd been to Cardiff before on holiday, but what struck me in terms of mental health nursing was there were quite a lot of differences between mental health nursing in Wales and mental health nursing in England. So I think that's a good place to start, really. If we can just go around and maybe just have a bit of a conversation about that to start off with. What's unique about Wales?
Yeah, so I'm happy to start that conversation. I moved to Wales from Scotland about 4.5 years ago. And what kind of struck me, my reflections around that is probably Wales is more similar to Scotland than England. So we've got health boards, integrated health boards, as opposed to NHS Foundation Trust. So that's a very different kind of context that you're working in as a mental health nurse. I think we are, let's say, perfectly sized. So there's that connectivity, and you get to know people quickly. There's real positives around that, around connecting and talk and being able to talk to everybody. I think there are other differences in terms of policy-wise. It's quite close, so you link quite quickly to the leaders across Wales, and that can open up conversations that are quite interesting. I think you've got the remote and rurality. You know, we've got the cities and the rural bits. It's a beautiful place to live, actually. I think I'll let Ben and Michelle pick up some of the other differences as well from their perspective, who's been in Wales a bit longer than me.
Yeah.
I mean, naturally, a lot of the legislation regulations will be similar, so there'll be themes that run across each of our nations. I think there are some unique differences in that in Wales we have what's called the Mental Health Wales Measure, which is very much around primary care part 1, part 2 is about secondary care mental health, and what we call the care and treatment programme, which is very different to what they have in England. So, and it's about these principles that are slightly different within Wales than what you might see in England, for example. And just to touch on what Hazel was saying, and I think we've noticed this in particular through the last 6 months, which have been incredibly difficult times for people. whereby the ability to work very closely as health boards, particularly nursing and nurse leadership professionally within those health boards, has really helped to shape direction, to have those very important conversations in a very timely way, but also influence what might be able to happen next, for example. And I think we all sit on what's called the All Wales Senior Nurse Advisory Group, and that's very much around how we inform policy, how we are able to increase the voice of nursing within Wales, for example. And it's that networking that makes a considerable difference. So I've worked in both England and Wales, and there's something about the values and the core principles that underpin it.
Yeah, that struck me that day when I spent the day in Cardiff. I know it's a few years ago, but I do remember it really well, and I do go to a lot of events, and well, I did pre-COVID. And what struck me is everything that you've said, that there seemed to be a much flatter sort of leadership structure, in the sense that people in the room who were mingling with each other, you could see the connections between people in leadership and clinicians who were, you know, suggesting things and recommending things. And you could see that that conversation was happening. And even, you know, in terms of like political leaders who were there that day, who seemed, you know, really accessible. So for me, I did think it was very different, and it did seem very values focused. That was kind of what I took away from it. So yeah, it's really interesting. Ben, do you want to jump in at this point?
I think there are real differences actually between Wales and other countries of the UK. I've spent more than half my life living in Wales. I was born in England. I became a nurse in England. So I practiced in England. And just before we kind of went live, I was just sharing an anecdote. It would have been in my first week or fortnight as a newly appointed teacher of community mental health nurses. And I said something like the CPA. So let's talk about the CPA. And in the late 1990s in England, everybody working in mental health services would have had a really good understanding of what the CPA was, the care program approach. And everybody in the room said, so Ben, what's the CPA? And I thought, aha, interesting. So I need to really be careful about my assumptions here.
Yeah.
Frameworks, the kind of standards that people might use. So kind of principles of coordinating care, that was familiar, but the language was different. There wasn't a policy in that way. In the way that there was in England. And of course, the country, Wales, is really distinct as a country. So so of the four countries of the UK, Wales has the oldest population. So around 20%, I think, of people in Wales are over the age of 65. That's more than in the other three countries. There are very high levels of poverty. So Wales is post-industrial, it's lost a lot of its traditional economy. A lot of work is in the public sector, but about a quarter of people live in poverty, and that creates all sorts of health challenges. So I think kind of health inequalities, you know, what that means for provision of services, for kind of meeting health need, and all of that. And there's also been relative political continuity in the Welsh Parliament, or the Senedd. So the Labour Party in Wales has consistently been in power, either on its own or in coalition, and that's created a really different ethos. So public services are definitely in the way that Hazel and Michelle have said, they're differently organised. So locality-based university health boards, no kind of purchaser provider split in the way that there is in England. What's the phrase? Any willing or any qualified provider, and the involvement of private sector organisations in NHS England. I mean, that feels different in Wales too. We don't have that in the same way. And then, as Michelle said, you know, very specific examples of specific bits of policy or legislation that are unique to Wales, and the Wales mental health measure is most definitely one of them. And it's not the only one, actually. I mean, so for example, the final example to give just for now, which is relevant to nursing, not just to mental health nursing, is of course Wales was the first country in the UK to lead on safe staffing legislation. Yeah, that's interesting in itself, isn't it? It is. Yeah, why do you think that was? Why do you think Wales... There was strong professional organisation and trade union lobbying, as I understand it. So the RCN in Wales, I know because I imagine that our friend Mick McEwen will be watching this, you see. So he will also want to remind us that Unison, quite right, we're also part of that. And Dave Monday, who's sitting behind the scenes, will say, and Unite. So they're kind of the Safe Staffing Alliance, which kind of crossed the UK. But there was a really, I felt it was a very strong Wales-based campaign to cement legislation, and it paid off. There was sufficient lobbying, sufficient energy, sufficient ability to influence legislators to make that happen.
And what was the outcome of that? Where are you with Safe Staffing in Wales?
I'll tell you, very interestingly, so come in and correct me if I'm wrong here, Hazel and Michelle, but the law was written without any particular area of healthcare in mind, but it first of all applied to acute medical and surgical inpatient settings. But actually the aspiration now is to extend the principles and the practice into mental health care. So it's about to come into mental health inpatient settings. Am I right, Hazel, Michelle?
It's already in place in surgical and medical wards, and there is work being done to take it forward in a number of work streams. There's one to do with district nursing, and they're also looking at paediatrics, but there is a mental health work stream that again is, there's an exec nurse director who leads that work stream, but we've also got a lead in the All Wales Senior Nurse Advisory Group. So we're very much involved in that work, looking at the principles. So there's work being done that will help get us to the position where it will be easier, hopefully, to bring on board. It's quite complicated work, looking at how you make decisions around staffing, but it's really important and has a lot of support to take it forward and to try and work through some of that complexity so that we can make those clinical professional judgments and use the data and information we have to try and triangulate and come up with some decision making. So yes, I think Wales has done well around that. And just to finish up this, the other thing I would add is that what we probably have less of is some of the organisations, think tanks. So we draw a lot in England for information because we've only recently got our HEIW, which is equivalent Health, Education and Improvement Wales, which is similar to HEE in England. So there's positives, but I think we don't have some of the infrastructure either. So some of that infrastructure is building, and we look across the borders and to other countries quite a lot for some of the data and information.
Yeah, is that easy to do? Is there a lot of connection between England and Wales from a nursing point of view, for example?
A fair bit through mental health nurse academics and the expert group. I think it's difficult sometimes because there are all those distinct differences. So it's a bit like you can't quite measure apples and pears. So some of what we're trying to look at is different.
Yeah. Oh, it's interesting.
I wonder if sorry, I do apologise.
Oh, no, just go over to you then, Michelle, and then maybe to Nicky to see if anything's coming in from social media.
I just wondered if it was timely to mention the mental health nursing framework in Wales.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we're particularly proud of. We developed it. We worked very, very closely together across all the health boards. It was very much co-produced. Mental health nurses, students, academics really worked to develop that framework from 2018 to 2028. And it very much underpins all the things that we've just spoken about and hopefully we'll continue to talk about. But I actually think if we're talking about something unique in Wales and a unique contribution of mental health nursing, that framework in Wales has made a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
I just wanted to touch on that at that point. Thank you.
I think it's important. So where would people find information if people are watching tonight and wanted to know about the All Wales Mental Health Nursing Framework? Is it available or?
It is. I mean, there are particular links, but even if you put it into the search engine, it would come up.
Yeah.
But we can put that link on as well.
Brilliant.
I've tweeted it already.
Too far ahead with it all.
I don't know why you doubt me.
But we can't allow you to get complacent, can we? Anyway, Nicky, any questions coming in from social media?
We haven't got any in yet, but I did have a bunch of students through today, so I actually asked them about it, and their response to policy was not as enthusiastic as Ben's.
No.
This may shock you guys. deep breaths. And when I was talking to them, how do you use it? Basically, people were describing sort of bringing it up online and then raiding it for quotes. And very few students really seemed to understand the power that they were holding in their hands by having that information. Oh, are you waving? Someone else who's super keen on policy.
Hazel's getting excited.
I am actually. And
Breathe through it.
I know, but I think that's a really important question, isn't it? Is how to understand, what does policy mean for staff, students, and people who use services, I suppose. And it doesn't surprise me that people aren't interested in it. And I think that's one of the barriers, and one of the questions we need to think about is how do we actually help people think about what that means? Because if we influence, it's seen as something that's done to us, isn't it, or something we draw on for information. Whereas actually, if we influence policy, and we can and should, we're influencing the care of today and tomorrow. And also, if you think about it, with policy comes a lot of resource. So if you can influence policy, you're not just influencing the care of today and tomorrow and the standards and the quality of care, you're probably also able to influence where that resource allocation is going. So to me, I think it's a really important area. But I get there's lots of barriers, and really interesting what you're saying, Nicky, around that students. It's not the sexy area of study, is it?
I think a lot of them found it quite difficult to read it and quite difficult to understand how they could use it.
Yeah.
If anyone's got any suggestions.
I want to speak directly to your students, Nicky. So hello, Nicky's students at Middlesex University. I really, and I know that I'm more unusual than you are, or than they are, because, I am interested in policy. I've kind of made it a bit of a thing, and that's not commonly found, I don't suppose. But it honestly, it is the case, isn't it? There are policy frameworks that will have a direct bearing on what Nicky, your students can and can't do, on what registrants can and can't do. Policy will kind of set a framework, it will shape, it will frame, it will constrain, the boundaries of people's professional roles, the tasks that they can perform. It is an explicit act, isn't it, of policy that student nurses in England now have to take out student loans, but in Wales, student nurses do not. They are supported through government bursaries. And if there was ever an example of direct policy having a straight down the line bearing on the lives and the material circumstances of student nurses, then that would be it. Loads and other examples. Years ago, nurses could not prescribe, and now they do. So that's an act of policy that's kind of made that happen. Years and years and years ago, there were no mental health nurses working in the community. But if we think about the kind of the long policy or the long program of shifting the focus of mental health care from hospitals to the community, that is an expression of kind of policy will over many decades. That's created opportunities for mental health nurses to do kinds of work that simply didn't exist in the past. So I know I know that policy seems really, really distant from the kind of face-to-face everyday practitioner encounter, but it's so important. It absolutely does all those things. It shapes, frames, creates opportunities.
I think as well, there's go on. You go ahead, please, Michelle.
Oh, I was about to say, I just wonder if it says something about how we engage with people about policies and procedures. And so are they meaningful? Do they provide the purpose and actually make a difference for staff and for service users and their families and carers? So very often if I were to look back when I was a student in my early career, then they were a guide, they were a point of reference. But actually, were we truly genuinely engaged in what that actually meant? So I think there's something around how we do, how they're actually brought in, how we think about them, how we co-produce them. Service users sat with us thinking about, actually, if we had this is what the outcome would be. So I think sometimes it's the way in which we've gone about it. They kind of tend to appear when they're about to go out of date, if I were to be honest, or people suddenly think, we've got to have a policy for this, rather than thinking what will be different by having this.
Exactly. I think that's right. And I think, I know when you were doing the All Wales Mental Health Nursing Framework, the first thing you did was talk to mental health nurses, wasn't it, about what was important to them and what mental health nurses. So right at the start, you kind of set the tone that this was co-produced, this was involving nurses, this was for nurses. And that doesn't happen all the time. I think, what you've just said, I totally relate to. And I think we were saying just before we went live, weren't we, as well, that how do we get different voices heard as well in policy? Because if nurses generally don't think policy involvement is for them, you're probably going to get only a particular type of nurse that comes forward to get involved in that work. But how do we get other voices heard? Because surely policy is more meaningful if we, if we have a wide range of voices heard rather than just a very small elite number of people who are involved. And I don't know the answer, but interested in your thoughts about how we change the culture around that. How do we get more people involved?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And it's about creating the opportunities, isn't it? And helping people see the opportunities. So we also, it's really important to involve students in the development of the framework. So we did a series of kind of workshops with students. But what I didn't do with them, actually, what we didn't do with them was point out that this was them influencing policy. So there's a bit about raising awareness and helping people actually see what they're doing is developing policy, and it is influencing, and it is having an impact. Because if you think about it, we're the largest profession in mental health services, but I'm not sure we have the largest voice always compared to other disciplines. And what nurses are usually good at, and I'm not saying other professions aren't, but if we're powerful and our voice is loud, we're usually quite good at empowering people who use services as well and bringing their voice into it, which is really important, isn't it? So I think there's something about opportunity, something about joining the dots for people to help them see that when they are influencing policy, and it's through the doing rather than the being taught about it in the classroom. I suppose is the opportunity to make it more about experiences. But I do think what we do at undergraduate level is quite important around making it interesting. I don't know what Ben or Nicky's views or they're sitting in academia are. I don't think we've got it right at an undergraduate level.
I think it's readability.
Yes.
A lot of that stuff. I mean, it's really bizarre, isn't it, that we would write a policy that the people it's about can't understand, and the people who are supposed to use it can't get to grips with it. I mean, it's almost, I wouldn't say it's analogous to the dreaded module handbook that no student ever reads, but it's about up there, I would say.
It feels like rhetoric, doesn't it? It doesn't feel like like real life. It sometimes feels like lots of very well put together principles that nobody would disagree with, but what does it mean in practice? And I think we need to sometimes tease that out before we can help them think, what does that mean in practice? So Ben's examples are really helpful.
Yeah, I think social media is influencing policy though, because I know a while ago somebody sent me publicly on social media a policy. It was somebody who used services, and it was a policy for the organisation where she'd use services. And she was basically saying, look at the language in this policy. What do you think about it? And she sent it to me and a few other people. And to be honest, I did comment honestly and professionally about what I thought. But I guess that policy was taken down. And my point is that we can't get away anymore of writing policies in ivory towers, can we? Because of the age of social media. And the direction of culture, the fact that service users and carers want to have a voice now and will have a voice, and if they can't have a voice through organisations, they can have a voice through social media, through talking, blogging, whatever it is. There's different ways now, isn't there, of influencing?
I'm quite interested in your thoughts on sort of nurses and power. I think before someone was commenting about a history of activism and mental health nurses in particular taking this kind of outsider stance and being really proud of it. And well, that's great, but sometimes an insider stance is super helpful.
No, I agree, Nicky. Influence again is really interesting, isn't it? We talk a lot around the power relationship between ourselves and people who use services, and quite a lot around the power relationship with ourselves and other professional groups. Yeah, and I think there's something around as a group what are mental health nurses like in terms of power and influence, and obviously we're all different, so it's a broad spectrum. But I wonder sometimes if if we're quite activist, I think, as a group, potentially quite a lot of mental health nurses I know that I would say are quite activist, and I suppose I think it's probably because one of the things that draw us into mental health nursing is that want to make a difference, but that want to fight social injustice and for equality. So that brings a set of traits with it, doesn't it, or values that I think are quite, we were talking about the uniqueness of Wales, there's probably a uniqueness of mental health nursing as well, that you're likely to find this set of traits in most mental health nurses. So it maybe makes us a little bit more activist, which can be a really good thing. And you see activists making a huge, significant difference in influencing things like policy, what we've just talked about. But I wonder sometimes, be interested in other people's thoughts around, do we explore or think about some of the negatives that can bring? And I remember early on in my career, I think I was still a student, some of the, and this was in Scotland, there was a strike and some of the nurses went out and strike. Some of these were fantastic nurses, but I think, looking back, it did impede their career. It had a negative impact. I have no evidence for that, but some of them didn't progress as well as I thought they should. So I wonder if sometimes you're seen as a troublemaker and what challenges that might bring to your career, or if you're excluded from being round the table, and whereas you might have more influence if you were round the table. I don't know what other people think.
I think you're right. It's that concept of rebellion as well, isn't it? And that overused cliche about rocking the boat and staying in it. But it's a fact, isn't it, that sometimes we're not going to progress unless we ask those challenging questions. But as you say, Hazel, it's a fine line between being the person to ask those questions and then being the person who's ostracized and no longer included. And there's obviously lots of speak out and speak up campaigns happening now, and freedom to speak out guardians and things, so people can speak out, can't they, and feel that they're speaking out confidentially. But I personally think there is still that perception that if you're an activist, are you a troublemaker? Are you going to get into trouble? I still think that culture exists, and I still hear people who feel that they can't speak out and they can't have a voice and they can't be active. I think that in England, I think mental health nurses are becoming more politically active as people are becoming more and more unhappy with the way things are. I think, a few years ago when people were unhappy, but it's on a continuum, isn't it? But we didn't have the austerity that we have now. A lot of people said that they weren't able to be political in the jobs, whereas I think now a lot of mental health nurses I speak to say that, they have to be political because of the situation. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
I think people are more politically astute, and I do hope that we, both, through professional forums and leadership and education, that we are helping our students, our future workforce and our current workforce to really think about how they can politically and professionally influence change, whether that be modernisation of services that will truly make a difference for people, whether it's around research education or the direction of practice. So there is something about that political astuteness. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's something about the word power and the definition of power. It's often seen sometimes as quite a negative connotation, a negative concept. It doesn't align neatly to the image of nursing. And what that brings, that modesty, that humble nature of an individual that, has been around for a very, very, very long time. And it's what you see or determine as power, isn't it? Because I think in my career, I qualified in 1992. That's a very long time ago. And I think through my career, the people who I've looked up to, people who I've seen as role models, have very much sat within that definition of almost like tools of professional excellence, who really very articulately, with their skills, their knowledge, their credibility and their voice, can really ensure that things are heard and actually they influence change and decision making, or even to say, this is not okay. And actually, to me, I look at power in that way as well. And I think that, particularly from nursing, that can make a big difference. So the kind of softer side of it, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's something about the social history of nursing which is significant here as well. So nursing historically has been a gendered role, isn't it? So women, in nursing there are more women than men. If you think about some of the narratives that we still hear today, that, for example, disposition, some kind of innate ability to care is sufficient and all that's required for nurses to nurse, which has also meant that the educational preparation of nurses has been held back for so long. You know, we were really late in arriving as a graduate profession, and I think that all those things then, despite our numbers, you know, there's over 600,000 registered nurses, aren't there, in the UK? It's kind of getting on for 1 in 100 of the population. But all those kind of historical demographic features of nursing, the way it's been held, the regard it's been held in, has kind of held us back and has kind of stopped nursing or nursing representatives from kind of being at the elite policy making table to really influence how, for example, the health service is organised. It goes right back to the origins of the NHS. You know, doctors needed to be incorporated. Doctors needed to have their pockets stuffed with gold, was the kind of famous saying. But nurses just weren't in that frame. You know, it was not thought necessary. Nurses will do whatever's required, and our job is much more narrowly focused. And you know, that kind of legacy is probably never quite gone away.
Yeah.
As well, medics get training to understand how to do this stuff, to how to debate, how to work a room, how to get your point across, how to understand how your voice is important, how to get it heard. We don't deliver that to our nursing students often, and then we wonder why none of them just automatically have those skills.
Yes.
And I find that strange.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point, Nicky, isn't it? Why would we expect that people will have those skills? Why would we expect that part of their roles would be that they will influence and they should influence if we're not actually helping to nurture that, you know, from the off?
And I think something I've been guilty of, and I think other people too a little bit, is having a healthy distrust of management and not really encouraging people to be part of it, to actually say, well, actually, no, we're going to do it differently.
Yeah.
You know, and that there's a different way to do this, that you can have compassionate leadership that's actually real and not just a blog, and you can have concern for service users absolutely as your primary goal and deliver a service. I think when I was growing up in nursing, we had some, you know, it seemed to me that we were recruiting psychopaths at one stage. We didn't say that on the job description, but it was pretty much what was happening. And then wondering why our services were getting decimated in England. So, I mean, I look to the Welsh, you know, the Welsh glory. I think, oh my goodness, can you imagine?
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate the inability of nurses to influence and to change, though. Because there are plenty of good examples where nurses have kind of acted collectively to bring about all sorts of change, often expanding the boundaries of what nurses do. So, you know, the ones mentioned earlier around things like prescribing and all the kind of new roles that mental health nurses potentially have under the Mental Health Act, which is an interesting piece of legislation that applies across Wales and England, actually, as it happens. Nurse-led services. Think about the whole investment in psychosocial interventions from the 1990s onwards. Yeah. So there would have been alliances of people who were part of that in London and in Manchester, but nurses were right at the heart of that. You know, demonstrating that nurses can fulfil big leadership responsibilities, can develop very, very, very advanced clinical skills, which previously would have been thought of as being beyond the reach of mental health nurses, and quite clearly aren't, you know.
I do think, though, Ben, there's a real point there about how are we preparing future nurses and the current workforce around some of these areas. We've touched on policy, we've touched on power and influence, and the other one for me is around that strategic thinking. You know, I've had numerous conversations around, you know, a really interesting conversation that got me thinking on it was when somebody was telling me about their experience of being told, being unsuccessful at a job and being told they weren't strategic enough in their thinking. And that started this conversation. So what is strategic thinking, and how do you know if you're doing it or not, and how do we teach and support it? And when you unpick it and tease it out, it's around, you know, strategic thinking for me is around anticipating change. It's around reading the landscape. It's around knowing what's coming over the hill, it's around challenging assumptions. It's kind of, talk a lot about joining the dots. You know, it's like how you join the dots. You look at the policy, look at what's happening in practice, and then it's around how you use all that to make the right decision, sometimes a tough decision, quite quickly. But again, you know, it's like I can't remember ever going through any kind of educational or development support that helped me think about strategic thinking. So to give somebody feedback at an interview, you know, I was thinking that the example I gave earlier, that you're not strategic enough, I think it's quite interesting, isn't it? How are we actually trying to help that next generation?
Yeah,
leaders think strategically. I don't know what people's thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I agree. It's things like access to mentoring, isn't it? Coaching, you know, professional development opportunities. And again, back to what we were saying earlier, that particular people, you know, some particular personalities of nurses might push themselves forward for those things, but other nurses might not push themselves forward for that and might never think, actually, I'd really like a mentor, but, you know, have I got time to have one? Where will I access one? Am I worthy of having one? And all those kind of things. And I still speak to nurses who just work in the same organisation for the whole career, for example. And how are you going to learn what's beyond the walls of your organisation if you never go beyond the walls of that organisation? I think it's really good for people to get broader experience and to sort of see beyond the sort of organisational walls and, you know, enter into people's communities and things. You know, it really changes perspectives, doesn't it? And so I agree.
You set the audience off between the lot of you.
Responsibility to, yeah, to kind of lead and develop the staff, really.
Absolutely.
So what's coming through, Nicky, on the social media?
I assume that people have been spitting the tea out everywhere because they've certainly started typing. They're happy, but they're chatty.
Happy and chatty.
I agree. So Adrian, I agree the framework in Wales has been beneficial, supported some of the alcohol work. Particularly great was the gastro teams working with mental health services. Passion for person-centred care was outstanding. One question coming up there, how do you get buy-in from non-mental health colleagues? On Twitter, Graham McIntosh, hello Graham, honest, inclusive, transparent approaches to policy development is essential. So that idea, exactly the same what Michelle was saying on that one. Sam, based on personal experience within HEIs, the curriculum has an element of public health and health promotion, and this is useful to help students start to familiarise themselves with policy. But how do we give thought to how they'll continue to influence their practice? So once they've got out of it, what then? But exactly as Michelle was saying, by the time they get out of it, all that policy they learned is out of date. Yeah. So there's something around understanding you always have to keep updated. Someone else says, I feel that politicians in Wales listen to healthcare professionals. In England, the political door is closed.
Oh God.
So lots of different points there. If anyone wants to pick up one of those.
Just on that last point, as an example, so do you remember when there was we will all remember, when the junior doctor strike in England, which did not happen in Wales, and I'm pretty sure that the Welsh government, I think it was Mark Drakeford, who's now First Minister, but when he was Minister for Health or Health and Social Services, I can't remember the exact title he would have had in Welsh government, I'm pretty sure that he put a big advertising promo video out, which was directed at healthcare professionals, junior doctors. We come to work in Wales, we will work with you. You know, we won't trammel over you, we won't kind of tread over you. We'll collaborate with you and we'll be partners with you. We won't try and force these new contracts on. So it's a really interesting, a very particular pitch at a time of industrial conflict. You know, industrial relations difficulty in England, never here, never in Wales though. Unless somebody now.
You might also call it opportunistic, Ben.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course.
I'm interested in what's unique about the work that was mentioned about person-centred care in Wales, because that was described as outstanding, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it was, again, about the buy-in between non-mental health colleagues, that one. And the reason that particularly worked was obviously when you're working with people who have severe alcohol issues, they're going to have physical health complications as well as mental health needs, addiction needs.
So that was about acute and mental health working well together. Yeah.
And it can be a challenge, can't it, to get buy-in from different specialities, because people's focus is going to be wider than mental health. I suppose that for me is an example where a framework or a policy can help, because you can use that as part of your kind of argument, or trying to convince or influence somebody that this is a good thing to do, and there's you've got this policy backdrop, you've then got the evidence base, and then you've got this is the difference it'll make in the data. So I do think that's where, if back to policy, it can be helpful in influencing, but I do recognise it can be a real challenge sometimes to lots of issues we're trying to raise the profile of mental health across all the sectors, haven't we?
Yeah.
And a quick point on that is it's really, really, really important to have people like you, Hazel. And we're lucky to have you as you, actually. But the fact that you occupy the role that you occupy in the Chief Nursing Officer's office in Wales, and therefore have access to Welsh Government, is so important. And not every bit of the UK has necessarily always had somebody who speaks for mental health nursing.
It's often different, isn't it? And to be fair, I think a big part of my role is to try and make sure the voice of mental health nursing is there when we're having in the policy team and when we're having conversations. And a lot of the strength of having the All Wales Senior Nurse Advisory Group is that's an advisory group for Jean, so it's the Chief Nursing Officer's Advisory Group, and that's about trying to bring that voice of mental health nursing close. So because I have limited expertise in limited areas. I probably shouldn't say that, should I? But whereas if I can connect the Welsh Government or CNO to the breadth of fantastic mental health nurses that are out there, that's a lot better intelligence and information coming in. And it's a two-way.
And there are now across each of the countries there's somebody doing that work, isn't there? So Emma Wadey in England.
It's similar but different in each country. So so again, that's a difference, isn't it? So Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the nursing officers or professional advisors sit in Welsh Government, whereas in England, Emma sits in NHS England. So it's slightly different, and we do talk regularly as a group, and it's interesting exploring what a lot of the issues are similar for our population across the countries, but some of the differences are around how we operate as differently.
Yes.
There's a bit of a theme here, isn't there? It's just picking up on what we've just said, but also about what Nicky. Really nice to have that feedback about patient-centred care, because this is what it's all about.
Absolutely.
And what we're touching on is partnership working, isn't it? So the real difference between being able to work closely with other health boards, being able to work closely with academics, and Hazel, for example, makes a massive difference. In the same way, when we talk about patient care, person-centred care, if we work together, it makes a massive difference for the person that's at the heart of it. And that's what it's all about, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Any more questions, Nicky? And then I'm just aware of the time. We've got a few minutes.
There was Sam's question wasn't quite answered about the fact that students do get exposed to policy whilst they're actually in uni, when almost as an act of torture, it would seem, but yes, they do. What happens then when they're sort of newly qualified nurses? Because that's often the time when you start to plan your career trajectory, isn't it? And if maybe this is something that you would, how are we sort of supporting young nurses in their practice to get into a space where they're passionate about policy?
Yeah.
Well, I think that people could do worse than to work with others. So join a professional organisation, join a trade union, join a subject group. So, I mean, an example for that bit of the profession that works in universities would be Mental Health Nurse Academics UK. But so I just use that as an example because I'm closely involved there with Mental Health Nurse Academics UK. But through groups like that, through Unite, through Unison, through the RCN, organisations are often looking for people, aren't they, to kind of volunteer, to come forward, to join phwer, to join committees, and that puts people in a really direct place to actually say something, to influence and to help shape policy, to help shape practice. So it's probably not a case of trying to do it on your own. You have to find others. Who are the people who are like-minded? Who are the other kind of people who are sufficiently motivated, sufficiently active, sufficiently engaged, share some of your values and want to kind of make a kind of a bigger, broader difference. So find friends, I would have thought. Work together, collaborate with people.
I agree. It's finding opportunities, isn't it? And having conversations so that you actually tease out what is policy and how you're influencing it. So some of the conversations we've had tonight around help, having more conversations like that. And there's not a lot of time and opportunities sometimes in a busy shift to have those. I completely appreciate that. But it's to think through what policy means for you, isn't it? And where the influence and opportunity is for you. What is it that you want to do? How do you want to make a difference? And how can influence, power, strategic thinking, policy all help you do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Stunned into silence. So
I think we are actually on 45 minutes.
Yeah, we should just go. I think we should just go around because we're running slightly over, which isn't unusual for us. But we love the conversation, don't we, Nicky? And
I love a chat.
We do. We love a chat. So I guess for the last few minutes, would it be helpful just to go around everyone really with anything that we've missed, any take-home messages, that kind of thing, before we finish for the night? So if we start with Michelle.
The thing that's left with me is that it's about equal responsibility here. So it's not about a student nurse in university. It's not about preceptorship and what happens in that first year. I think we are all responsible for making a difference with this. And nothing gives me more greater pleasure than actually seeing it, hearing it, feeling it in work in the NHS and across other services. It makes such a difference, but we all have to play a part in that.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been quite a strong message tonight, hasn't it, as well? Hazel?
Kind of echoing what Michelle said. But for me, it's like if a take-home message would be seeing policy as something we influence, not something that happens to us. So that would be my kind of take-home message.
Yeah. And then over to you.
I'm going to go back to Nicky's students. And I hope that they and others who kind of think, what is all this policy thing then? It's got nothing to do with me whatsoever. I would hope that this discussion has persuaded at least some people that it's really, really super relevant. It really, really will have a bearing. It will shape what people do, the opportunities that we have. And the more that we collectively, as a profession, can get involved in shaping it, the better.
Yeah, totally agree with you. All of you. Nicky, any final thoughts from yourself?
I think the idea that, sort of nurses, be students or practitioners, are smart, they're ethical, they're organised, they understand what it's like actually to be around people who need that support. And there is nobody really, other than service users, who they also support to have a voice, better placed to be making choices and decisions. And, it's time to step up, I think. We've seen what happens when other people make them. Best just to put in the hours and get it done, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think on that note, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and thank you all for joining in tonight. I think the message for me is around, democratising these spaces and conversations and, getting people's voices heard, people who work in services, but also bringing the voice of people who use services as well and supporting them to have a voice. And it's been really interesting listening to some of the differences around mental health nursing in Wales as well. And I guess people listening probably had no idea. I certainly didn't until I came over to Cardiff that time and realised, what opportunities there are without this sounding like a recruitment campaign for you all. I think, So I think really interesting conversation, and one that we might come back to as well, hopefully at some point as well, to catch up with you all and see how things are progressing. And I think on that note, we should say good night and thank you, everybody. And if you're listening, thank you as well for joining in. If we've missed any of your comments, we will have a look at social media later and we'll try and answer any questions or refer anything on to any of our panel. So I'll say good night there and thank you. Good night.
Diolch yn fawr.